Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Party. Today we're quilting this beautiful wiggly wobbly cosmos. It's a really fun design. It's going to cover your quilts with this dynamic texture. So let's get on the machine and learn how to stitch this with walking foot style quilting. So I've already gotten started and quilted half of my wobbly cosmos just simply by quilting every other line. And I did mark this design with this stencil, and I marked every other line of the stencil so that way it would be a little less dense and I would have a little bit more space here on the outer edges. So you could mark every line or you can mark every other line. It really doesn't matter. I just like it. I like the look of it when the lines spread out a bit. So this design is quilted from the center to the outer edges. Similar design is Jagged Cosmos and Bright Star. You pull up your bobbin thread to the top and then begin stitching. And here I'm just stitching right on that marked line. Now to stay on that marked line with a deep curve, I'm going to need to lift my walking foot and pivot the quilt slightly. I'm lifting the foot here with my knee lifter. So that if you see it lifting and you're wondering what's going on, that's my knee lifter shifting it over. So you have to do these stops and starts and shifts whenever you're quilting with deep curves. Otherwise, if you try and kind of steer and stitch at the same time with a deep curve, more than likely going to start torquing the fabric just a little bit too much, putting just a little too much pressure on it. When the curves get bigger towards the outer edges, you can start to stitch and steer. See how I can just flow through that? And I'm just going to stitch right off and into the batting so I can break thread. And don't worry about quilting off into the batting. I can secure this stitching whenever I go to trim up my block and put my blocks together to make a quilt, or if I bind the edges. So I'm just going to tie off this thread tail here. I'm using a cheater needle to tie off and bury it. And you can find another video on how to do this, and I go into a lot more detail and explain each step and how to tie off, and then also how to tie off short thread tails if you ever like run out of bobbin thread or something like that. So that's tied off. And it is a good habit to get into, to tie off and bury every single thread tail as you stitch. Now, because all of these threads are starting from the center, you might want to back off just a little bit and maybe pull up thread one stitch from the center. And that way you don't get a whole ton of thread breaks right in the middle of your quilt, which could definitely start to get a little bit dense. There we go. So pulled up thread, take a few careful stitches, and also be careful to rotate the block, shifting it so that way stay on that line. You know, quilting on a marked line is a different skill. You know, there's quilting freehand, that's basically quilting without marks, and that's a fun skill to build. Sometimes we use the edges of our walking foot to help guide the foot, you know. But quilting on a marked line is also an important skill, and it is absolutely not cheating. It's the only way that you can quilt a design and end up with a perfectly symmetrical shape. So in this situation, the reason why I wanted Wobbly Cosmos to turn out this way is I just really wanted it to be nice and pretty and form this perfect swirly center shape, you know? You could also quilt this freehand, and the simple rule is just start in the middle and wiggle your way to the outer edges. You could absolutely quilt that without marks. But, you know, it's really, you have to look at what is your goal for the quilt and what look do you want. You know, sometimes I want something that's very random and chaotic, you know, like crazy curves, you know, I just want something that's kind of all over the place. And sometimes I want a design that is more structured and will fill the space and have a little bit more of a predictable path through the area, or I want something to line up just exactly right. Or, you know, I want the lines to hit certain places. You know, all of those things are factors that I think about whenever I'm planning my quilting design. Now, I got minky on the back of this block, so I'm going to have to stop and lint roll every once in a while just to keep it clean. And from here, I'm just going to continue doing the exact same thing. Drop my foot, drop my needle down, bring up that bobbin thread. This is great practice for bringing up your bobbin thread and tying off thread tails, that's for sure. I'm going to start stitching slowly and carefully, and just stitch right on that marked line as I curve my way out. Being careful with those deep curves to pivot and shift it. Now, where will Wobbly Cosmos work best on your quilts? Well, this would be a great design to stitch as an all-over quilting design. So let's say you start in the middle, pull up thread, and stitch your wiggly lines towards the outer edges. And you just continue stitching one line at a time until the entire quilt was covered in this wiggly wobbly texture. Now, because as you get further out, the lines will get further and further apart, you might want to do a little stitching in the ditch on a quilt that you cover with Wobbly Cosmos, just to be sure that you've got enough stability and the batting won't shift in the middle layer. So that's a good tip. If you wanted to quilt this into a small section of a quilt, so let's say maybe the background blocks of the infinity knot quilt, then yeah, pull up thread on one of those blocks and just stitch the wiggly wobbly shapes, those lines, quilting from the center of those spaces. And then you could maybe even stitch from the ditches back into the middle of the block. That's an option too. So lots of ways that you can use this design in your quilts. And here's what it looks like whenever I finished Wobbly Cosmos. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot quilting Wobbly Cosmos along with me today. This is such a beautiful design, a really nice wobbly wiggly texture for your quilts. Of course, it is a little tricky to get everything to line up just right in the center. So if you'd like, check out my stencil that I've created to make marking this design much easier. You can check it out in a link below this video. Now, if you'd like to take your squares, trim them down, and turn them into a real quilt, like the Marvelous Mosaic quilt here behind me, you can find the instructions and quilt pattern for Marvelous Mosaic in my book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day. We're going to stitch out all 30 designs from this book, and you can pick your favorite 20 to put together to create this quilt. So definitely check that out at leahday.com/walkingfoot. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt!